The plane had been gliding smoothly above the clouds, a hushed lull settling over the passengers. Businessmen slept with jackets draped over their faces, a mother bounced her fussy baby, teenagers laughed over shared earbuds. Then, without warning, the roar of the engine sputtered and died. Every light in the cabin flickered and went dark. An eerie silence swallowed the space, so complete it seemed to press against their ears. A second later, the plane shuddered violently. Oxygen masks dropped with a hiss. Panic ignited like wildfire. Passengers screamed and clawed for the dangling masks. The mother next to the window clutched her baby and sobbed uncontrollably. An older man mumbled frantic prayers. A flight attendant's voice cracked as she tried to calm people, her own eyes wide with terror. Over the intercom, the captain's voice came on, trembling, breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have lost all power. Please stay calm." But calm was impossible. The plane was falling, gliding powerless through the thin air at 30,000 feet. Amid the chaos in row 17 sat Emily, a slender teenage girl with long dark hair tucked behind her ears. She wore a faded blue hoodie and hugged a canvas backpack tightly to her chest. She hadn't spoken to anyone the entire flight, answering only with polite nods and shy smiles when offered a drink or a snack. Now she sat perfectly still, the mask swinging in front of her untouched. She felt her heart thundering, but her expression didn't change. Instead, she closed her eyes. She could almost hear her father's voice, steady, calm, explaining engine-out emergencies in the old flight simulator they'd built together in their garage. He'd always said, "If it happens for real, remember, breathe, think, act. Fear makes you forget what you know." Emily's fingers dug into the straps of her backpack as she took one deep breath. Around her, people wailed and pleaded with God. The plane jolted again, the nose tilting slightly downward. The smell of fear and recycled air hung heavy. She opened her eyes slowly. No one was looking at her. No one ever really did. But her father had. He'd seen what she could do. She exhaled, forced her shaking legs to move, and unbuckled her belt. She was going to try. Even if no one believed she could. Red emergency lights cast eerie shadows along the narrow cabin, pulsing like a warning heartbeat in the dark. Overhead compartments rattled with every lurch of the powerless plane, and the cold rush of wind seeped in through unseen cracks. Flight attendants shouted over the noise, trying to soothe passengers who would not be soothed. One was on her knees beside an elderly man who clutched his rosary so tightly his knuckles had gone white, muttering desperate prayers in a cracking voice. In the row ahead, a young mother rocked her shrieking baby, tears streaming down her own face. She pressed the mask to the child's tiny mouth with shaking hands, her voice breaking as she whispered, "It's okay, baby, it's okay," even though she didn't believe it. Fear was a living thing on that plane. It choked the air thicker than the smell of sweat and stale coffee. People yelled into phones that no longer had service, sobbing final messages. A man pounded on the locked cockpit door, demanding the pilots do something, anything, to stop the plunge. And in row 17, Emily sat frozen for one more heartbeat, her backpack still pressed tight to her ribs like a life vest. The red light gleamed in her wide eyes. She could feel the terror rising in her chest like a scream she wasn't sure she could contain. But then she closed her eyes. She forced the noise to fade. She wasn't on a falling plane, not right now. She was in the dusty garage with her father. He was leaning over her shoulder, explaining calmly how to keep a cool head. How to save lives even when everyone else was panicking. His voice was gentle but firm, "It's going to feel like the end of the world. That's when you do what no one else can." Her lip trembled, but she swallowed the sob. She inhaled slowly through her nose, exhaled through her mouth. When she opened her eyes again, they were steady, clear. The fear was still there, but now it sat behind something stronger. Emily unbuckled her seatbelt. The click sounded impossibly loud in the chaos. She pushed to her feet, knees shaking but locked in determination. Around her, no one noticed the quiet girl in row 17 standing up to face the end of the world. But she noticed. And she was ready to try. Emily staggered down the narrow aisle, grabbing at seatbacks for balance as the plane rocked and dipped. Passengers yelled at her to sit down, some too terrified to even see her, others too lost in their own prayers. Her hair stuck to her damp forehead under the pulsing red lights. She reached the front, where two flight attendants blocked the cockpit door with their bodies like human shields. "Sit down," one of them snapped, voice cracking with panic. "Go back to your seat." Emily shook her head, chest heaving. "Please. I need to talk to the captain. I can help." They exchanged looks, one angry, one desperate. The plane jolted again. Overhead bins popped open, bags spilling into the aisle. Somewhere a child shrieked. "You're just a kid," the older attendant yelled over the noise. "You can't help. We're trying to maintain order." Emily pressed her shaking palms together. She fought to keep her voice steady. "Listen to me. My dad was a pilot. He taught me on flight simulators for years. I know emergency procedures. I know how to restart power. Please. If you don't let me try, we're all going to die." The attendants froze. One of them burst into tears. The other clenched her jaw, studying Emily's face. Her eyes flicked over the teenager's trembling hands, the honest terror there, but also something else. Determination. Clarity. "Say that again," she demanded, voice low. Emily swallowed. "I know the emergency power reset. I can talk to the captain about the bypass procedures. Please. Just let me try." For one horrible second, the plane fell into another dip and the whole cabin screamed. Oxygen masks swung like pendulums in the red glow. Finally, the flight attendant lifted her radio with shaking fingers. She spoke in a hushed voice to the captain behind the locked door. The silence afterward was agonizing. Then the intercom crackled. The captain's voice sounded ragged, broken with fear but also with hope. "Row 17, send her forward." Emily let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. As the attendant stepped aside, the passengers fell into a stunned, eerie hush. All eyes followed the quiet girl as she walked toward the cockpit door, her shoulders squared, a teenager with the weight of 100 lives on her back. Emily stepped through the narrow doorway into the cockpit, and it was like entering a tomb. Darkness wrapped the cramped space, broken only by dim emergency indicators and a scattering of blood-red warning lights that blinked like dying stars. The air smelled of sweat and fear. The captain sat slumped in his chair, face buried in trembling hands. The co-pilot frantically paged through a battered manual with shaking fingers. Alarms shrieked and then died in powerless silence. The only sounds were ragged breathing and the creak of the fuselage under brutal turbulence. Emily swallowed hard. Her heart pounded so loudly it threatened to drown out everything. She slid into the co-pilot's seat, pushing aside tangled headset cords. For a moment, she just sat there, her eyes closing. She heard her father's calm voice again, "Breathe. Think. Act. Don't let fear decide." When she opened her eyes, they were clear and focused. "Captain," she said softly but firmly. He looked at her with hollow, hopeless eyes. "We need to reset the auxiliary power bus. Manually. Now." He blinked, confusion fighting with desperation. "That's insane." "We tried." Emily shook her head. "Not the way I'm going to do it. Trust me." She didn't wait for an answer. Her fingers flew over the darkened control panel, finding circuit breakers by memory and touch. She whispered each step under her breath the way her father had drilled her. The co-pilot, stunned, watched her, then snapped into action at her commands, flipping switches, helping her override the jammed systems. A sudden whine filled the cabin, a stubborn engine trying to catch. Lights flickered on, sputtering. Warnings turned from red to yellow. The plane stopped falling. It leveled out in the air with a deep groan. In the cabin behind them, a hush fell. Then sobs. Passengers clutched each other, masks askew, tears streaming down their cheeks. A mother kissed her baby's forehead, murmuring frantic thanks. Strangers held hands across the aisle. Prayers mingled with breathless relief. Emily kept her eyes on the panel, voice steady as she called out coordinates to the co-pilot to radio for help. Outside, dawn was breaking over a sea of clouds, casting golden light over a plane that refused to die. Her fingers trembled, but she didn't stop. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was her father's daughter. And she was going to bring them all home. The wheels screeched against the cracked asphalt of the remote airstrip, smoke billowing in white clouds as the plane rattled to a desperate halt. Sirens wailed outside, red and blue lights flashing against the dawn that broke in brilliant pink and gold over the horizon. Fire trucks roared closer, crews in silver suits waving them in, ready for disaster that, somehow, hadn't come. Inside, the cabin was filled with sobbing relief. Seatbelts unbuckled with frantic clicks. Passengers stumbled into the aisle, some limping, some carrying children, all pale and exhausted but alive. Flight attendants shouted directions, guiding the crowd through the emergency slides and onto the cold tarmac. Emily sat in the co-pilot's chair for one long moment after the engines finally fell silent. Her hands were still locked on the yoke, knuckles white. She let out a shaking breath. She felt sweat cooling on her face, her hair plastered to her cheeks. The captain turned to her, eyes shining, voice cracking as he whispered, "You saved them all." But Emily just nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. When she finally stood and followed the others out, she blinked against the rising sun. The air was cold and clear. All around her, passengers gathered in huddled groups, some on their knees in prayer, others sobbing in each other's arms. When they saw her step out of the plane, a hush fell over the crowd. Then applause erupted, raw, unfiltered, thunderous. People clapped until their hands hurt, cheers breaking the silence of survival. The mother she'd watched clutching her baby ran to her, tears streaking her face. She wrapped Emily in a fierce hug, the baby squirming between them, and sobbed into her shoulder. "Thank you," she gasped. "God, thank you." Emily blinked hard to keep from crying herself. She rested a gentle hand on the baby's back and managed a small, shy smile. Then she spoke softly, voice trembling but clear enough for those around to hear. "My dad taught me to help people," she whispered. "Even if they don't see you coming." The mother hugged her tighter, and the people around them wept openly. And as fire crews ran final checks on the smoking plane, the camera of memory pulled back over that battered craft resting safe on the runway. The quiet girl who saved them all stood small but unbowed among the crowd. Because sometimes, the quietest among us carry the greatest strength. And the world is saved by those brave enough to try.